That seat is not for people like you." The words cut through the music like a knife across glass, sharp enough that the laughter around the ballroom faltered for a moment before rising again in awkward ripples. Darius Cole had just lowered himself into the chair beside the long marble table when the voice came from behind him. He looked up slowly. A tall man in a tailored navy suit stood there with his hand resting on the back of the chair as if he already owned it. Beside him stood a woman in a silver evening dress whose expression held the cool confidence of someone who had never once been told no in her life. The room around them glowed with warm chandelier light that reflected off polished floors and crystal glasses. Conversations drifted between clusters of founders, investors, and executives who had come to the private celebration hosted by Samuel Bennett, one of the most influential venture capital leaders on the East Coast. Darius had arrived quietly only minutes earlier. No one had noticed him walk past the velvet rope. No one had noticed him except a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. And until this moment, no one had cared where he chose to sit. The man in the navy suit cleared his throat and tapped the chair again. "I believe this table is reserved for founders and investors," he said with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The woman beside him tilted her head slightly as she studied Darius, as if trying to solve a puzzle that did not belong in the picture before her. "You might be more comfortable near the bar area," she added gently, though the softness in her voice carried an edge of dismissal. Several nearby guests turned their heads. Someone let out a short laugh that quickly died when no one joined it. Darius remained seated for a quiet moment, his hands resting calmly on the table beside the untouched glass in front of him. His dark suit was simple but well-tailored, the kind of suit that did not shout for attention. He looked from the man to the woman and then briefly around the room, where polished shoes and designer gowns filled the space with quiet signals of wealth. Then he rose without a word and stepped aside from the chair. Before we continue with this story, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Darius moved away from the table and walked toward the far side of the ballroom, where tall windows overlooked the quiet city streets below. Behind him, the man in the navy suit pulled out the chair with a satisfied nod and gestured for the woman to sit. The music resumed its easy rhythm. Conversations picked back up. To most of the people in the room, the moment was already forgotten. Yet across the ballroom, near the entrance, Samuel Bennett had just stepped inside with the event coordinator Nina Torres. As his eyes scanned the room, they stopped suddenly on the tall figure standing alone by the window. Samuel straightened at once, his expression shifting from casual conversation to sharp recognition. "Well, I will be damned," he murmured under his breath. Nina followed his gaze. "Who is that?" Samuel began walking toward the window without answering, his pace quickening with every step. Because the man quietly watching the city lights beyond the glass was not just another guest who had taken the wrong seat. The man standing there was the one person in the building whose decision tonight could change the future of every company in that room. Samuel Bennett moved through the ballroom with the quiet urgency of a man who had just realized something important was unfolding in his own house without his permission. Nina Torres followed half a step behind him, her eyes moving between the clusters of guests and the tall figure standing near the window. From across the room, Darius Cole looked almost invisible again, just another guest watching the lights of the city reflect across the dark glass. Yet Samuel knew exactly who he was looking at, and the realization sent a ripple of alert energy through his chest. Guests stepped aside politely as Samuel passed, nodding with recognition, some reaching out to greet him, but he barely slowed. At the center table, the man in the navy suit had already settled into the chair he had claimed, leaning back with easy confidence, while the woman beside him crossed her legs and surveyed the room as if she were evaluating a portfolio of people. Their names were Ryan Whitmore and Claire Whitmore, and tonight meant everything to them. Their company had spent the last year building momentum, gathering attention, and tonight they believed they were about to meet the investor who could carry their technology into the national spotlight. Ryan lifted his glass and spoke quietly to the group gathered around the table, his voice full of confident excitement. If everything goes well tonight, we will finally secure the backing we need. Samuel Bennett personally invited the investor who has been reviewing our proposal. Claire smiled in agreement, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she glanced around the room. She had noticed the man who had been sitting in the chair only minutes earlier, but the moment had already faded from her mind. People wandered through these events all the time, curious guests who did not understand the rules of rooms built on power and capital. Across the ballroom, Darius remained near the window, holding his glass of sparkling water and watching the movement of traffic far below. The city hummed with its endless rhythm, yellow lights sliding across wet pavement as evening traffic moved through the streets like a slow river. He could hear the music behind him again now, soft jazz returning to fill the silence that had briefly touched the room earlier. Voices blended together in the background. Laughter rose and faded. Waiters passed with trays of small plates and glasses that glimmered beneath the chandeliers. Darius did not seem troubled. His expression carried the calm patience of someone who had spent years watching rooms exactly like this. Samuel finally reached him. Darius turned slightly as the older man approached, and a quiet smile touched his face as recognition settled between them. Samuel extended his hand immediately. "Darius Cole, you decided to arrive quietly again. I should have known." Darius shook his hand with an easy nod. "I prefer to see a room before the room sees me." Samuel laughed softly, though his eyes moved past Darius for a moment toward the center table, where Ryan and Claire continued, speaking confidently with their small audience. Nina Torres stepped forward beside Samuel and offered her own greeting. "Mr. Cole, welcome. We are honored you could attend tonight." Darius inclined his head politely. "Thank you. It looks like a successful gathering." Samuel followed his gaze across the ballroom. "Yes, and several companies here tonight are hoping to meet the person who may decide their future." His voice carried a subtle note of amusement. Darius glanced once more toward the center table, where Ryan Whitmore lifted his glass again, explaining the vision of his company to the guests around him. Claire leaned close to him with a bright, confident smile, unaware that Samuel Bennett was now standing across the room beside the very man they had quietly dismissed from their table. Samuel folded his hands and looked back at Darius. "We are about to begin the evening announcements. I was planning to introduce you formally to everyone here." Darius paused for a moment, as if considering the idea, then looked again toward the table where Ryan and Claire sat proudly in the seats they believed belonged to them. A thoughtful expression crossed his face, calm but observant. "That sounds interesting," he said quietly. "Perhaps it will be more interesting than they expect." Samuel followed his gaze once more and slowly nodded, because in that moment he also remembered something else. The chair Ryan Whitmore was sitting in had originally been reserved for only one guest that evening, the investor whose arrival every founder in the room had been waiting for, the man who now stood quietly beside the window, watching the entire scene unfold with patient silence. Ryan Whitmore leaned forward in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who believed the evening was unfolding exactly as it should. The glass in his hand caught the chandelier light as he gestured toward the group of founders gathered around the table. His voice carried the steady rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. "Our platform is built to solve a problem every major logistics company faces," he said, speaking clearly while Claire watched the reactions around them with quiet satisfaction. The small circle of listeners nodded politely. One man adjusted his glasses and asked a few technical questions. Another guest swirled the drink in his glass while listening carefully. Ryan welcomed every bit of attention. Across the ballroom, the music softened slightly as staff members moved near the stage area. Nina Torres stepped toward the microphone stand while technicians adjusted the sound. Conversations across the room gradually lowered into a respectful murmur as people sensed that the formal part of the evening was about to begin. Samuel Bennett and Darius Cole stood together near the tall window, watching the room settle into anticipation. Samuel glanced at his watch and then toward the stage. "It is almost time," he said quietly. "Nina will begin the introductions in a moment." Darius remained calm, his gaze moving slowly across the ballroom, as if studying a painting that revealed new details the longer he observed it. He watched Ryan speak animatedly to the group around the table. He watched Claire laugh softly at something one of the guests said. Neither of them looked toward the window. Neither of them noticed the direction of Samuel Bennett's attention. Nina Torres stepped to the microphone and tapped it gently. The sound carried through the speakers, and the last conversations faded. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome," she said with a warm professional smile that filled the room. "Thank you all for joining us tonight for the Bennett Capital Innovation Reception." Samuel Bennett hosts this gathering each year to bring together founders, innovators, and investors who are shaping the future of American industry. Several guests lifted their glasses while others turned their chairs toward the stage. Ryan leaned back slightly, still smiling as he listened. Claire crossed one leg over the other and rested her hand on the table with relaxed confidence. Nina continued speaking. "Tonight, we have an exceptional group of companies represented here. Some of the most promising ideas in logistics technology, renewable energy, medical research, and advanced software development are being presented in this room." Samuel Bennett stepped away from the window and slowly began walking toward the stage. The movement drew the attention of a few guests nearby. Ryan noticed it as well and nudged Claire lightly. "That means the introductions are about to begin," he whispered. Claire nodded with excitement. "This is the moment we have been waiting for." Nina paused for a moment before continuing. "And of course this evening would not be complete without the presence of a very special guest whose work has helped shape several of the most successful companies in the modern investment world." The room grew slightly quieter. Even as servers paused near the walls. Ryan straightened in his chair and adjusted the front of his suit jacket. He had been preparing for this introduction all evening. Claire glanced around the room as if trying to identify which of the powerful figures nearby might be the investor they had hoped to meet. Nina smiled as she looked toward Samuel Bennett, who had now reached the edge of the stage. Samuel gave a small nod of approval. Nina turned back to the microphone and continued. "Tonight we are honored to welcome a man whose strategic investments have helped launch companies that now influence industries across the United States." Ryan's pulse quickened slightly. He leaned forward in his chair, his attention fixed on the stage. Claire did the same. Around them, several founders exchanged curious glances. Nina's voice remained calm and clear as she delivered the next line. "Please join me in welcoming one of the most respected venture investors in the country, Mr. Darius Cole." For a brief moment, the room remained silent as the name settled into the air like a sudden shift in gravity. Ryan blinked once, the sound of the name echoing strangely in his mind. Claire frowned slightly, as if trying to remember where she had heard it before. Then slowly, almost instinctively, Ryan turned his head toward the tall window across the ballroom. Because the man Samuel Bennett was now inviting onto the stage was the same man who had quietly given up his chair only a short time earlier without saying a single word. For a brief moment after Nina Torres spoke the name, the ballroom seemed to forget how to breathe. The soft jazz music continued somewhere in the background, but the sound felt distant, like it was coming from another building entirely. Conversations stopped in mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The name Darius Cole settled over the room like a sudden change in weather. Ryan Whitmore felt the air shift before his mind fully understood why. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass he was holding. Across the table, Claire blinked once, then twice, her confident smile fading into a puzzled expression as she quietly repeated the name in her mind. Darius Cole. She had heard that name many times during the past several months while researching investors who might fund their company. Every article described him the same way. Quiet, strategic, the man behind several of the most successful technology exits in the last decade. Claire slowly turned her head toward the tall window across the ballroom. Ryan followed her movement almost instinctively. And there he was, the same man who had stood up from their table earlier without argument. The same man who had given up his seat without a single complaint, standing calmly beside Samuel Bennett, as if the entire evening had been unfolding exactly as he expected. Ryan felt a strange, hollow feeling open in his chest as the pieces began to fall into place. Around the ballroom, a wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Some guests turned toward the window with sudden recognition. Others looked around the room as if trying to confirm what they had just heard. Nina Torres stepped slightly aside from the microphone as Samuel Bennett walked onto the stage. Samuel waited for the murmurs to settle before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a calm voice that carried easily through the room, "it is my pleasure to introduce a man whose judgment has helped shape some of the most important companies of our time. A man whose investments have created thousands of jobs across this country and helped bring new technology into everyday life." He paused briefly, allowing the attention of every person in the room to settle completely. Then Samuel extended his hand toward the far side of the ballroom. "Please welcome Mr. Darius Cole." The entire room turned toward the window. Darius did not rush. He simply set his glass down on a nearby table and adjusted the sleeve of his jacket before beginning to walk across the floor. His steps were unhurried, steady, almost relaxed. Each step seemed to echo quietly against the polished marble floor as the crowd parted instinctively to make space for him. Some guests nodded respectfully as he passed. Others watched with open curiosity. A few founders exchanged quick, nervous glances with their partners. Ryan Whitmore could not move. His mind replayed the moment from earlier in the evening with painful clarity. The chair, the words he had spoken, the quiet way the man had stood and stepped aside. Claire felt the same memory surface at the same time. Her stomach tightened. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched as the man they had dismissed from their table walked calmly toward the stage where Samuel Bennett waited. Darius reached the front of the room and shook Samuel's hand. Samuel smiled warmly and stepped aside as Darius turned toward the microphone. The ballroom was silent again. Not the polite silence of a formal event, but the tense silence that follows a realization no one expected. Darius looked across the crowd slowly, his eyes moving over the faces gathered in the room. For a moment his gaze passed over Ryan and Claire's table. He did not stop. He did not react. Yet Ryan felt as if the brief glance had lasted much longer than it actually did. Darius finally spoke. "Thank you for the warm welcome this evening." His voice was calm, steady, and surprisingly gentle for someone whose decisions could determine the future of so many companies in that room. "I always enjoy gatherings like this because they allow me to meet the people behind the ideas." He paused and let his eyes travel across the audience once more. The room remained completely still. Then Darius added a quiet sentence that carried far more weight than the words themselves suggested. "And sometimes the most interesting introductions happen long before anyone steps onto the stage." Ryan felt the meaning of that sentence settle heavily in the center of his chest as the realization fully arrived. The man speaking calmly at the microphone was not just the investor they had hoped to impress tonight. He was the man they had already judged and dismissed before even knowing his name. The silence that followed Darius Cole's words was not the polite quiet of a formal gathering. It was the heavy stillness that settles when a room begins to understand something uncomfortable about itself. Darius rested one hand lightly on the edge of the podium while his eyes moved calmly across the crowd again. He did not rush his speech. He did not raise his voice. The calm in his tone carried more authority than any dramatic introduction could have created. "I believe innovation is not only about technology," he continued slowly. "It is also about character. Every founder in this room tonight has a vision for the future. Every investor here has the ability to shape which visions become reality. That responsibility should always remind us that success begins long before the numbers appear on a balance sheet." Several guests nodded quietly as they listened. Others shifted slightly in their seats as if feeling the weight of his words settle around them. Ryan Whitmore sat perfectly still. The earlier confidence that had filled his posture was gone now. In its place was a tightening feeling in his chest that he could not ignore. He kept replaying the same image in his mind. The moment earlier, in the evening when he had placed his hand on the back of that chair. The moment he had spoken the words that now echoed in his memory with uncomfortable clarity. This table is reserved for founders and investors. Claire Whitmore felt the same pressure building quietly beneath her composed expression. She folded her hands together on the table and stared toward the stage, but her thoughts were no longer focused on the speech. Instead, they circled the same realization that had already reached Ryan. They had spent months hoping to meet the man speaking at that microphone. Months preparing presentations and financial projections for the moment they believed might change their company's future. And when that moment had arrived earlier in the evening, they had not even recognized it. On stage, Darius continued speaking with the same calm rhythm. "When I look at a new company, I rarely begin with spreadsheets," he said. "I begin with the people. I watch how they treat others when they believe no one important is paying attention. Because the way a person behaves in the quiet moments often tells you far more than the most polished presentation ever could." A quiet ripple moved through the audience as several listeners exchanged glances with one another. Samuel Bennett stood to the side of the stage, watching the crowd carefully. He had hosted events like this for many years, but even he could feel the unusual tension in the room tonight. Darius was not accusing anyone directly. He had not raised his voice or pointed to any specific table. Yet the message behind his words seemed to move through the ballroom like an invisible current. Darius paused for a moment and let the silence settle before continuing. "Every great company begins with an idea, but every lasting company begins with integrity. That is what I look for when I decide where to invest my time and my resources." Ryan lowered his eyes toward the table. The glass in his hand remained untouched. Claire felt her throat tighten slightly as she realized something else. Darius had looked directly toward their table only once since stepping onto the stage. The glance had been brief, calm, almost indifferent. Yet that single moment had carried more meaning than any confrontation could have delivered. Darius concluded his remarks with a simple nod toward the audience. "I am looking forward to meeting many of you tonight and hearing about the work you're building. Thank you for being here." The room responded with respectful applause that gradually grew louder as the tension began to release. Some guests stood. Others raised their glasses in acknowledgement. Yet at the center table, Ryan and Claire remained seated, their applause slower and quieter than the rest of the room, because they both understood something that the rest of the crowd did not yet know. The most important conversation of the evening had already happened earlier that night, and they had failed it before they even realized who they were speaking to. The applause gradually faded into the soft hum of conversations as guests began to stand and move across the ballroom once again. Glasses clinked gently. Servers resumed their quiet paths between tables carrying silver trays filled with small plates and sparkling drinks. The music returned, smooth and calm, as if the room itself was trying to breathe again after the tension of the speech. Darius Cole stepped away from the microphone and shook Samuel Bennett's hand once more before moving down from the stage. Several investors immediately approached him, offering polite greetings and quick introductions. Darius responded with the same calm patience he had shown all evening, listening more than speaking, nodding thoughtfully while each person tried to leave a good impression. At the center table, Ryan Whitmore remained seated for several seconds longer than everyone else around him. The room seemed louder now, but the noise felt distant in his ears. Claire leaned slightly toward him, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear it. "We need to speak with him," she whispered. Ryan nodded slowly, though the confidence he had carried earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. For months, he had imagined the moment when he would finally meet Darius Cole. In every version of that meeting, he had been composed, persuasive, impressive. None of those imagined versions had included the memory that now replayed in his mind again and again. The moment when he had taken a chair. The moment he had spoken those words with casual certainty. Ryan stood from the table and adjusted his jacket, though his hands felt strangely unsteady. Around them, other founders were already beginning to move toward the area where Darius was speaking with a small group of investors. Claire rose beside him and forced a polite smile as they walked across the ballroom floor. The distance between their table and the group surrounding Darius was not far, yet every step seemed heavier than the last. Several guests stepped aside to allow them through. A few recognized Ryan and greeted him with quiet nods, unaware of the tension building inside his chest. Darius was listening to a question from a tall man in a gray suit when Ryan and Claire finally reached the edge of the group. The investor finished speaking and Darius responded calmly, offering a thoughtful answer that made the small circle laugh lightly. The conversation felt relaxed, almost effortless. Ryan waited for a pause before stepping forward slightly. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully. Darius turned his head toward the voice. For a moment his expression remained neutral, as if he were simply acknowledging another guest in the room. Then recognition appeared quietly in his eyes. The recognition was calm, controlled, not angry, not surprised, simply aware. Ryan felt the weight of that calm recognition more than any accusation could have made him feel. He cleared his throat before continuing. "My name is Ryan Whitmore. This is my wife, Claire. We are founders of Whitmore Logistics Systems." Claire offered a polite nod beside him. "It is an honor to finally meet you," she added gently. Darius studied them both for a brief moment. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it carried a quiet tension that everyone nearby could feel. Then Darius gave a small nod. "Yes," he said calmly. "I believe we have already met this evening." The words were not harsh. They were spoken with simple clarity. Yet Ryan felt them land with the force of a truth that could not be avoided. Around them, the nearby guests suddenly found other conversations to focus on. Some drifted slightly away from the circle. Others pretended to study the artwork along the ballroom walls. Claire felt a warm flush rise across her face as she remembered the earlier moment with painful clarity. Ryan forced himself to speak again. About earlier, he began slowly. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding." Darius raised one hand gently, not interrupting with anger, but with quiet composure. "There was no misunderstanding," he said calmly. "You believe the seat belonged to someone else." And for a moment, Ryan realized that the man standing in front of him was not interested in embarrassment or revenge. Darius Cole was interested in something much simpler. He was interested in seeing what Ryan Whitmore would do next. Ryan Whitmore felt the quiet weight of Darius Cole's words settle over the small circle around them like a sudden drop in temperature. The music continued somewhere behind them, and conversations flowed across the ballroom. Yet within that small space the air felt still. Ryan drew a slow breath before speaking again, forcing himself to meet Darius's calm gaze. "You are right," he said carefully. "There was no misunderstanding. I spoke too quickly and made an assumption I should not have made." Claire stood beside him, her posture still composed, but her voice softer than before. "We should not have treated you that way earlier this evening," she said. "It was disrespectful, and we're truly sorry for it." Darius listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. Around them, several guests pretended to examine their phones or drifted into nearby conversations, though many still watched from the corners of their eyes. Samuel Bennett observed the exchange from across the room with quiet interest, knowing that moments like this revealed far more about people than any formal presentation could. Ryan continued, aware that every word mattered now. "Earlier tonight, we believed we were protecting a space that belonged to someone important. The truth is we did not stop to consider that the person already sitting there might be that someone." Darius nodded slightly, not dismissing the explanation, but not encouraging it either. Claire added quietly, "We have spent months studying the work you have done for companies across this country. When we realized who you were after the announcement, it became clear how badly we misjudged the moment." Darius rested one hand lightly on the back of a nearby chair and considered them for a moment before speaking. "The interesting thing about rooms like this," he said calmly, "is that everyone believes they can identify importance simply by looking at it. The suit someone wears, the table where someone sits, the group of people gathered around them." Ryan lowered his eyes briefly as the truth in those words settled deeper. Darius continued in the same measured tone. "But real influence rarely announces itself when it enters a room. It usually arrives quietly and waits to see how people behave before revealing anything at all." Claire felt the tension in her chest tighten slightly. She understood now that the man standing before them was not interested in embarrassing them publicly. Instead, he was allowing them the chance to face their own assumptions. Ryan spoke again, this time more carefully than before. Our company has been hoping for the opportunity to present our work to you tonight. But we understand that our actions earlier may have already answered questions you did not even need to ask. Darius studied Ryan's face for a long moment, searching perhaps for something beyond the apology itself. Then he asked a simple question. Tell me something, Mr. Whitmore. When you believed I did not belong at that table earlier, what made you so certain that the seat could not possibly be mine? Ryan hesitated. The honest answer felt uncomfortable, yet avoiding it would only make the moment worse. I looked at the room and assumed I understood who belonged where, he admitted. I believed I could recognize the people who mattered here. Darius nodded once, slowly. That is a very common mistake in rooms like this. He glanced briefly toward the ballroom, where dozens of founders and investors continued their conversations under the soft chandelier light. Many of them were still hoping to speak with him before the evening ended. Then Darius returned his attention to Ryan and Claire. The real question is not what happened earlier, he said quietly. The real question is what you have learned from it. Ryan felt the full meaning of that question settle over him. He realized that this conversation was no longer about a chair or an awkward moment at a table. It was about whether the man standing before him believed he had the character to build something worth investing in. And in that moment, Ryan understood that the future of his company might depend less on the presentation he had prepared and far more on the honesty of the answer he would give next. Ryan Whitmore stood very still after Darius Cole asked his question. The music and voices around them continued to move through the ballroom. Yet for Ryan, the room seemed to narrow into a quiet space where only 3 people existed. He felt Claire beside him, steady but tense, waiting for his answer just as Darius was. Ryan understood that anything less than honesty would end the conversation immediately. He drew a slow breath before speaking. I believe I could read the room, he said. I looked at the clothes people wore, the way they carried themselves, the conversations they were having. I assumed I understood the structure of the room. I thought I knew who belonged where. Darius listened without interrupting, his eyes calm and attentive. Ryan continued, choosing his words carefully. What I learned tonight is that I was not actually reading the room. I was judging it, and I judged it quickly. Claire nodded quietly beside him. She spoke next, her voice calm but sincere. We spend a lot of time talking about innovation in our company, she said. We talk about building systems that remove inefficiency and bias from complex supply chains. But earlier tonight, we showed that we still carry those same biases ourselves. The honesty in her words drew a brief silence between them. Darius considered the two of them for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than critical. Across the ballroom, a group of investors laughed at something near the bar, and a server passed by carrying a tray of glasses that reflected the chandelier light across the polished floor. Darius spoke again, his voice calm and measured. There is an important difference between a mistake and a pattern, he said. Everyone makes mistakes. The real question is whether the person recognizes it quickly enough to change the pattern before it becomes part of who they are. Ryan nodded slowly. That is exactly what I'm trying to understand about myself right now. Darius studied Ryan's face for a moment longer, searching perhaps for something deeper than the apology itself. Then he asked another quiet question. Earlier tonight, you believed you were protecting a seat for someone important. Tell me something. Why did that matter so much to you? Ryan thought about the question for a moment before answering. Because we believed that seat represented opportunity, he said honestly. Meeting the right investor could change the future of our company. We wanted to make sure the moment went the right way when it finally happened. Claire added softly, we prepared for that meeting for months. When we thought someone else was occupying that seat, we reacted without thinking. Darius nodded slowly. Opportunity has a strange effect on people, he said. It can make them generous, or it can make them afraid. And when people become afraid of losing something valuable, they often reveal their true instincts. Ryan felt those words settle into his chest with quiet clarity. The instinct he had revealed earlier that evening was not one he was proud of. Darius continued in the same calm tone. I invest in ideas, but I also invest in people. Because ideas change over time. Markets change. Technology changes. But character determines how a person responds when those changes happen. He paused for a moment and then asked another simple question. Tell me about your company, Mr. Whitmore. Not the numbers, not the projections. Tell me why you started it in the first place. Ryan blinked slightly, surprised by the direction of the conversation. Then he spoke slowly. My father drove freight trucks across the Midwest for most of his life. While I was growing up, I watched how inefficient the entire system was. Drivers waited for hours at warehouses. Routes were planned poorly. Everyone worked hard, but the technology supporting them was outdated. I wanted to build something that actually respected the time and effort of the people doing the work. Claire nodded as he spoke. That is the reason we started the company together. Darius listened quietly, absorbing the explanation without reacting immediately. When Ryan finished, Darius gave a small, thoughtful nod. That is a better answer than the one most founders give, he said calmly. Then his eyes moved briefly across the ballroom again before returning to Ryan and Claire. The real question now is whether the people building that system will show the same respect for others that they claim to build into their technology. Ryan understood exactly what he meant. And for the first time that evening, he realized that this conversation was no longer about recovering from a mistake. It was about proving that the lesson from that mistake had already begun to change the person standing in front of him. Ryan Whitmore remained silent for several seconds after Darius Cole finished speaking. The conversation around them continued to flow through the ballroom, but within the small circle where they stood, time seemed to move more slowly. Ryan understood that the moment had shifted. Earlier that evening, he had believed the most important thing he could offer this investor was a strong presentation about technology and logistics systems. Now he realized that the conversation had moved somewhere. Deeper. Darius was not studying a business plan. He was studying the people who would lead it. Ryan finally spoke, his voice steady but thoughtful. When I started this company, I believed efficiency was the most important thing we could build into the system. But the more we worked with drivers and warehouse teams, the more I realized that respect mattered even more than efficiency. People want to feel that their time and effort are valued. That is what our platform is supposed to do. It removes delays and confusion, so the people doing the hardest work are treated fairly. Claire added quietly beside him. The technology is designed to give drivers better scheduling, better routing, and more control over their own work. Many of them spend days away from their families just to keep supply chains moving. They deserve systems that actually support them. Darius listened carefully as they spoke, his attention focused completely on their explanation. He nodded once when Claire finished. Respect is an interesting word, he said slowly. Many companies claim they build systems that respect the people using them. But respect is rarely created by software alone. It usually begins with the people writing the code. Ryan felt the truth of that statement immediately. He understood that Darius was not criticizing their idea. He was testing whether the people behind the idea actually believed the values they claimed to support. Around them, several guests had begun to gather closer again, pretending to discuss their own projects while quietly listening to the conversation unfolding near the center of the ballroom. Samuel Bennett watched from across the room with a faint smile, recognizing the familiar pattern of one of Darius Cole's conversations. Darius often allowed founders to reveal themselves slowly through simple questions rather than dramatic confrontations. Darius continued in the same calm voice. When someone builds a system meant to treat people fairly, the responsibility becomes even greater. Because if the people designing that system do not practice fairness themselves, the entire structure eventually reflects that failure. Ryan nodded slowly. I understand that. Earlier tonight, we failed that standard. Darius did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked briefly across the ballroom toward the table where Ryan and Claire had been sitting earlier. The empty chairs were still there beneath the warm chandelier light. The chair that had started the entire conversation remained quietly pushed back from the table. After a moment, Darius returned his attention to them. Mistakes are not what concern me most, he said. Everyone in business eventually makes decisions they regret. What matters is how quickly a person accepts responsibility for the mistake and what they do after that moment. Claire spoke softly. Then tonight is a moment we need to learn from quickly. Darius studied both of them again, his gaze thoughtful rather than judgmental. Ryan noticed something in that expression that he had not seen earlier in the evening. The tension in the conversation was beginning to shift. It was no longer simply about an apology or a misunderstanding. It had become something closer to an evaluation of character. Darius asked one final question before speaking again. If another founder walked into this room tomorrow and treated someone the way you treated me earlier tonight, what'd you tell them? Ryan did not hesitate this time. I would tell them they had already revealed more about themselves than any investor needed to see. Darius held his gaze for a long moment after that answer. The quiet noise of the ballroom continued around them, but the small space between the three of them felt almost still. Finally, Darius gave a slow, thoughtful nod. That is an honest answer, he said. And honesty is a rare quality in rooms like this. Ryan felt a cautious sense of relief begin to rise, though he understood the evening was far from finished, because the man standing before him still had not said whether the conversation would lead to opportunity or simply to a lesson remembered long after the night was over. Ryan Whitmore felt the quiet nod from Darius Cole settle over him like a signal that the conversation had reached a turning point. The ballroom around them had grown louder again as the evening resumed its rhythm. Laughter rose from the bar area. A group of founders near the stage debated a new energy project. Waiters continued weaving through the room with silver trays. Yet the space around Ryan, Claire, and Darius still carried the quiet gravity of a conversation that mattered. Darius looked briefly across the room before speaking again. There is something you should understand about the way I invest, he said calmly. Most people believe investors make decisions after reading presentations or reviewing financial models. Those things matter, but they rarely tell the full story. Ryan listened closely, knowing every word now carried weight. Darius continued. In many cases, I decide whether I trust a founder long before they ever show me a single slide. Trust determines whether a partnership can survive the difficult moments that every company eventually faces. Ryan nodded slowly. That makes sense. Darius studied him for a moment. Earlier tonight, you showed me a mistake, but the conversation we just had showed me something else. Ryan waited quietly. Darius folded his hands together and spoke with the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of the evening. Most founders would have tried to defend themselves. Some would have blamed the environment. Others would have avoided the conversation entirely. Instead, you chose to acknowledge the mistake and explain what you learned from it. That tells me something important about how you handle pressure. Claire felt a quiet breath leave her chest. Ryan remained steady, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Around them, several nearby guests continued to pretend they were not listening, but many of them clearly were. Darius went on. The technology you described earlier is interesting. Logistics systems in this country still suffer from enormous inefficiencies. Improving that structure could have a meaningful impact on millions of workers. Ryan spoke carefully. That is exactly why we built the company. Darius nodded once. But technology alone does not determine whether a company succeeds. Leadership determines that outcome. He paused briefly and looked directly at Ryan. Leadership also determines how a company treats people when no one is watching. Ryan understood the meaning behind that sentence immediately. The earlier moment with the chair was still part of this conversation. Darius was not ignoring it. He was simply placing it within a larger evaluation of character. Darius continued in a thoughtful voice. Tonight you had a chance to show me who you are before any presentation ever began. The first moment revealed a weakness in your judgment. The conversation afterward revealed a willingness to confront that weakness honestly. Ryan absorbed those words slowly. The evaluation was clear. The mistake had not disappeared, but it had become part of a larger test. Claire spoke quietly beside him. Does that mean the conversation about our company is finished? Darius shook his head slightly. No, it means the conversation about your company has not truly started yet. Ryan felt a cautious sense of hope return. Darius continued. A real investment conversation requires more than a brief explanation in a crowded ballroom. It requires time, details, and the opportunity to study how a team actually operates. He glanced towards Samuel Bennett across the room, who returned the look with a faint, knowing smile. Then Darius looked back at Ryan and Claire. If you're serious about building the system you described tonight, then I would be interested in hearing the full story behind it. Ryan blinked once, surprised by the direction the moment had taken. Claire straightened slightly. Darius added one final sentence with quiet clarity. But before we discuss numbers or partnerships, I want to see whether the values you described tonight truly guide the way you build your company. Because the future of any investment depends far less on a business plan than it does on the character of the people responsible for carrying that plan forward. Ryan Whitmore stood quietly for a moment after Darius Cole finished speaking. The words were not dramatic, yet they carried a meaning that changed the entire direction of the evening. The conversation had moved beyond embarrassment and apology. Now it had become something more serious. It had become an opportunity, but one that came with a condition that Ryan understood very clearly. Around them, the ballroom continued to glow beneath the chandeliers. Groups of founders gathered near tall tables discussing new ideas. Investors moved through the crowd exchanging business cards and quiet promises to schedule meetings in the coming weeks. Yet for Ryan and Claire, the entire evening had narrowed to the calm presence of the man standing in front of them. Ryan nodded slowly. "We are serious about it," he said. "Every part of our company has been built around the belief that the people moving freight across this country deserve better systems than the ones they have been given for decades." Claire spoke next, her voice steady and thoughtful. "When we built the platform, we spent months traveling to warehouses and distribution centers. We spoke with drivers who spend days waiting for loading times that were never scheduled properly. We spoke with families who barely saw their loved ones because the routes were planned without any real consideration for the people doing the work." Darius listened carefully. His eyes remained calm, but attentive as they described the work. Behind their company, Ryan continued, "The reason this matters so much to us is because those inefficiencies cost more than money. They cost people their time, their health, and sometimes even their relationships. If technology is going to change an industry, then it should improve the lives of the people inside that industry as well." Darius nodded once, acknowledging the seriousness in Ryan's explanation. Across the room, Samuel Bennett continued, watching the conversation from a distance. He had seen this moment many times before. When Darius Cole began asking deeper questions, it usually meant the evening was no longer about polite introductions. It meant he was deciding whether the people in front of him deserved a real conversation about the future. Darius spoke again after a brief pause. "Earlier tonight, you made an assumption based on appearance and circumstance. That moment showed me something about your instincts. But the conversation since then has shown me something else." Ryan waited quietly as Darius continued. "The question now is whether the lesson from that moment will actually influence the way you lead your company moving forward." Ryan answered without hesitation. "It already has." Claire nodded beside him. "Moments like that force you to examine yourself honestly. If we want to build systems that treat workers with respect, then we have to demonstrate that same respect in every interaction we have with other people." Darius studied both of them carefully. The ballroom lights reflected faintly in his eyes as he considered their words. Finally, he gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Good leaders are not the ones who avoid mistakes. They're the ones who grow faster than their mistakes do." Ryan allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. The tension that had been sitting in his chest since the beginning of the evening was beginning to loosen. Darius then said something that caused Ryan to straighten again. "I will be in the city tomorrow morning. I have time for a meeting before my afternoon flight. If you would like to present the full structure of your platform, I would be willing to hear it." Ryan blinked once, almost surprised by how directly the opportunity had arrived. Claire felt the same quiet shock beside him. "That would mean a great deal to us," Ryan said quickly. "We would be honored to present the complete system." Darius raised one hand slightly, his tone calm, but clear. "Understand something before you come to that meeting. Tomorrow is not about convincing me with numbers or projections. It is about showing me how your company actually operates and how your leadership reflects the values you described tonight." Ryan nodded with full understanding. "That is exactly what we will show you." Darius gave one final nod before glancing briefly toward the center of the ballroom again. The empty chair at the table where this entire situation had begun still sat quietly beneath the warm light. Then he looked back at Ryan and Claire and spoke a final sentence before turning away. Sometimes the most important investment decision begins with a simple test of character. The conversation ended with a quiet nod from Darius Cole before he stepped away to greet another group of guests approaching from the far side of the ballroom. Ryan Whitmore and Claire Whitmore remained standing in place for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. The music continued to flow through the room with its soft, steady rhythm, but the tension that had filled Ryan's chest earlier in the evening had slowly transformed into something else. It was not relief exactly. It was something closer to clarity. Claire exhaled slowly and looked at Ryan. "Tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "That is a real opportunity." Ryan nodded, but kept his eyes on the spot where Darius had just been standing. "Yes," he said, "but it is more than an opportunity. It is a test." Claire understood exactly what he meant. Around them, the ballroom had returned to its normal energy. Groups of founders spoke eagerly with investors, hoping to secure the same chance Ryan and Claire had just been offered. Glasses clinked together in quiet celebrations. Laughter echoed softly near the bar. Yet for Ryan, the evening now felt very different from the one he had imagined earlier that day. When he first walked into the event, he believed success would come from delivering the perfect presentation to the right investor. Now he realized that the most important moment of the entire night had happened before any presentation began. It had happened the moment he made a quick judgment about someone he did not know. Claire touched his arm gently. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Ryan gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I am thinking about how easily we could have walked away from that conversation without learning anything from it." Claire nodded. "Instead, we were given a chance to correct it." Ryan glanced across the ballroom where the empty chair still remained at their table. The chair that had started everything. He walked back toward the table slowly, Claire beside him. Several guests nearby recognized them and offered polite greetings, unaware of the significance that single chair now held in Ryan's mind. When they reached the table, Ryan paused beside the chair for a moment before quietly pulling it back into place. Claire noticed the gesture immediately. He was not fixing the chair for appearance. He was acknowledging the moment that had forced him to examine his own assumptions. Samuel Bennett approached them with a calm smile. "That was quite a conversation you had with Darius tonight," he said. Ryan nodded respectfully. "Yes, it was." Samuel studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You handled the situation honestly. That matters more than you might realize." Claire looked curious. "Have you known him long, Mr. Bennett?" Samuel chuckled softly. "Long enough to know that he watches people very carefully before making decisions. Many founders believe they are pitching their companies when they speak with him. In reality, he is often studying their character." Ryan glanced once more toward the crowd, where Darius was now speaking with another group of investors. "I think I understand that now." Samuel nodded. "Good. Because if he invited you to a meeting tomorrow morning, it means he saw something worth exploring." Ryan felt the significance of those words settle in his chest. Not a guarantee, not a promise, just an opportunity to prove that the lesson from tonight would shape the way he led his company from this point forward. Claire squeezed his hand lightly. "We will be ready tomorrow," she said quietly. Ryan looked across the ballroom one final time before answering. "Yes, we will. Because the real presentation tomorrow would not just be about technology or logistics systems. It would be about showing that the people behind the company had learned something important about respect, humility, and the responsibility that comes with building a future others depend on." The next morning, the city felt different from the night before. The bright energy of the ballroom had been replaced by the quiet focus of early business hours as sunlight reflected across the glass towers of downtown. Ryan Whitmore and Claire Whitmore stepped into the lobby of a private office building where Darius Cole maintained a small investment office during his visits to the city. Neither of them spoke as the elevator carried them upward. The events of the previous evening still lingered in Ryan's mind, but the nervous tension he had felt earlier had now settled into a calm determination. When the elevator doors opened, they were greeted by a quiet reception area with large windows overlooking the river. A single assistant guided them into a conference room where Darius was already seated at the far end of the table reviewing a folder of documents. He looked up as they entered and offered a simple nod. "Good morning." Ryan and Claire greeted him respectfully and took their seats across from him. The room was bright with natural light, and the quiet hum of the city below drifted through the windows. Darius closed the folder in front of him and folded his hands. "I spent some time reviewing the materials you sent last night," he said calmly. "The technology behind your platform is well designed. The scheduling system alone could reduce idle time for drivers across several major freight corridors." Ryan nodded and began explaining how their system integrated real-time routing with warehouse scheduling. Claire followed by describing the pilot programs they had already tested with several distribution centers. Unlike the rushed conversations in the ballroom, this meeting moved with careful attention to detail. Darius asked thoughtful questions about the platform, the leadership structure of the company, and the way they planned to support the workers who would rely on the system. After nearly an hour of discussion, the conversation finally slowed. Darius leaned back slightly in his chair and studied them both with the same calm expression he had shown the night before. "Your company has potential," he said, "but what interests me more is the way you responded to the moment last night." Ryan listened quietly as Darius continued. "Many founders try to impress investors by pretending they never make mistakes. That approach usually fails because business is built on constant learning. Last night, you showed me something more important than a perfect introduction. You showed me how you respond when you realize you're wrong." Claire felt a small breath of relief pass through her chest. Ryan remained focused as Darius opened the folder again and slid a document across the table toward them. "I am prepared to lead the initial investment round for your company," he said calmly. The room fell silent for a brief moment as the meaning of his words settled in. Ryan looked down at the document and then back at Darius. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "We will work hard to justify the trust you are placing in us." Darius gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Remember something from last night. The success of this company will not depend only on the technology you build. It will depend on the way you treat the people whose work keeps the system moving." Ryan glanced briefly toward the window where the morning traffic moved steadily along the highway below. Thousands of drivers were already on the road delivering the goods that kept the country running. When he turned back toward Darius, he spoke with quiet certainty. "We will remember that." Darius stood and shook both of their hands before preparing to leave for his flight later that afternoon. As Ryan and Claire walked out of the building, a warm sunlight spread across the sidewalk, and the city felt alive with possibility. Ryan paused for a moment before they stepped into the street. "Last night we almost lost this opportunity before we even understood it," he said. Claire smiled gently. "Instead, we learned something that will shape every decision we make from here forward." Ryan looked back at the tall building behind them and nodded. Sometimes the most important lesson in business begins with a simple chair at the wrong table. And sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who teaches you what respect truly means.